The reason it's so bald is because in Jamaica, what I found is that people are totally unhesitant about expressing their hatred. It's overt, it's open, it's clear, they've thought it through. They will offer you literally chapter and verse to justify it, and the chapter and verse comes from the Old Testament. So you ask about changing the law and whether the law will influence certainly daily life for gays and lesbians in Jamaica, and I suspect not. I mean, I asked the same question. What I heard is it will only cause matters to grow worse. It will create a crisis. I've been spending a fair amount of time thinking about where all this comes from, and the themes that aren't addressed here is you constantly hear people saying that gay men particularly are predatory, that they're raping young boys and turning them into homosexuals. That's sort of a ground level belief in Jamaica. You're not born gay, you're made gay. And so there's a cadre of gay people out there creating new gay people, and they're undermining society. These are bedrock ideas, they're bedrock values. They exist at all levels of society, was my impression. There are people in Jamaica who are not homophobic, and certainly that's another part of the story, but I think from my experience, the majority express this and expressed it very clearly and very powerfully, and were willing to say it on camera. Not just politicians, but you'll see in some of the other pieces, religious leaders, famous religious leaders who are renowned for their ability to bring peace to the nation. You hear it in school children, you just hear it everywhere. It's quite pervasive. We're breaking a lot of taboos in these pieces. I think we're breaking the taboo of addressing anti-gay violence in Jamaica, which most people in Jamaica will still deny happens, even though they'll admit it happens. It's a strange cultural schizophrenia. We're breaking taboos by talking to people about their sexuality and their sexual practices. The young man, we have another young man who says it's not AIDS that's killing us, it's people that is killing us. So I don't use condoms. Why should I? Again, that's now being translated into the gay community. These values get reflected across the spectrum. We're breaking taboos by talking with the director of the public health program in Jamaica, who admits his program has failed. Although in the piece he'll say, it's not really his fault, it's gay people's fault. They should take better care of themselves. They're not taking responsibility. Though as we all know, AIDS is a virus, and it's a social problem and a systemic one. So that's a bit of blaming the victim. Though he acknowledges, both on camera and off camera, that the government in Jamaica has been aware that the gay community has had incredibly high AIDS rates for over 25 years. There was a study done about 25 years ago that came up with a 25% HIV incidence rate when they'd studied the gay community. So it's a secret. It's a secret that just hasn't been expressed. Another secret that hasn't been expressed we deal with in another piece, which has been called the bridging argument, which is that gay people are so oppressed that they hide, they marry, they lead regular lives, and then on the side they have their own lives, their own sexual lives. And what this does is it means that the gay community is not an isolated, definable, isolatable sector of society, as many people in Jamaica would like to think it is. They want to wall it off, they want to push it away and say, well, we just can't deal with this. But the reality is it's totally integrated into the sexual networks of the society. And Jamaican society has a very dynamic sexual life. Most men admit to having 2 or 3 partners, in marriage and without. The gay men that are surveyed come up with 2 or 3 male partners and 2 or 3 female partners. The standard categories of sexuality that we again would like to think are very clear-cut and defined simply don't mean anything in a context where there's violence and stigma and all the rest of these things functioning one on top of another. So the other taboo we're breaking is talking about the bridging language. If you have a 30% AIDS rate in the gay community, and that gay community is integrated into the mainstream community, then clearly AIDS is moving from a reservoir of virus. It's not an evil act, it's not an intentional act, it's a biological act. It's moving from one sector of the population to another. And that's what Dr. Figueroa tells us. As long as we are unable to deal with it or unable to handle it, we have a reservoir of incredibly high rates, and it just transfers out into the rest of society. That's not to say there isn't heterosexual transfer of HIV. That's of course happening. But you begin to understand that if you have this whole part of society that nobody's looking at, nobody's dealing with, nobody's able to come to terms with, then inevitably the AIDS rates will rise. And we have Miriam Malua talking about that quite openly. Again, another taboo, one that the international community, for a variety of reasons, doesn't want to address because it complicates the story. What I found in Jamaica is the story is complicated. It's not easily definable. It's not easily reducible. It's not just a matter of changing a law. It's not just a matter of containing it within the gay community. It's not just a matter of what does it mean to be gay. These are all complicated issues. But to even have a conversation about it is what I guess we were hoping to do, stimulate a conversation by opening up the issues for debate and discussion and let people argue it out. A long answer.
Thanks, and I wonder, Jason or Kwame or anyone on the panel, are there any efforts in Jamaica for the women's rights community or women affected by AIDS and men and MSM and who have sex with men who are affected by AIDS to start a dialogue about the way they are actually connected in this struggle? You know, you and I have talked about this. It's a hard one, but I wonder if anyone has any comments.
I just have one comment. I do disagree in some ways about Micah's description of taboo. I think there are certain kinds of taboo. Taboo, strictly speaking, is that when within a culture it breaks its own mores or silences, then there's an act of taboo. What we are engaged here with is that this is a reporter coming in and asking people questions, and so the taboo that is happening, if there's taboo breaking, it's not necessarily within the culture itself. So I think that's an important distinction. The other thing I'd say is that I think it's useful for us to say, you know, this is the first time this has been said, or this is the first, but I don't think that's actually true. I think there's adequate information and articulation and actually outspoken people. I run a festival in Jamaica every year, Calabash Rare Festival, where people have spoken up about these issues. Gay people have taken chances and articulated these issues in front of thousands of people. So there is, and I sort of caution myself in saying that, but I think your capacity to make change is to enhance those people who are actually in spirit and in attitude, consistently believing and holding to the views that you hold to. It is important to say that there are those voices that are trying to speak in that context, in as much as there's this voice that is speaking negatively in that context. And I think there are complications too with, if we really wanted to study it more closely, the sexuality, the issue of homosexuality, that's male sexuality versus female sexuality, that is lesbianism, it's played differently in the context in Jamaica. It's not that lesbians do not face attacks and acts of discrimination, but Jamaicans engage in it differently. We can see patterns in which Jamaicans engage in it differently. But then, even as I say these words, I'm always cautioned by the sort of blanket articulations that one makes. Jamaicans are this, or this culture is that, or this is that. And it'll be like me saying that Americans are you know, homophobic and are against the abortion. I mean, that's what it would sound like when, because there is, yeah, I live in South Carolina, you think that's how it is, don't you? So we have to be really careful about the way, and so when we see Ernie doing his thing, we say, okay, good heavens. And then we wish, and maybe we've tried and it's not been possible, that somebody else will say something that is the complete opposite of that position. And I believe that they are there, and I believe that there are people who will articulate it that way. But I do not want to say this in the context that would diminish the need for some really drastic action on the part of the society for these lives of people who are living in hiding and are anxious about the way that they're living in hiding, and those people who want to be supportive, who are afraid of even stepping into that context. So I'm simply sort of saying that the blanket articulations, you cannot simply sort of make these huge blanket statements based on a short trip.
But, let me add one more dimension then.
Yeah.
Our distinguished panelist from JFLAG, which is the premier gay human rights organization in Jamaica, operates anonymously. Nobody from JFLAG will identify themselves. There is not an open public voice advocating a gay rights position in Jamaica who speaks from that position, or maybe there's one or two, but certainly the main organization operates undercover. Support to the gay community, public health support, operates undercover in Jamaica. There are no posters counseling gay men about what's risky. There are no public information messages. There are no printed media about it. I think I'm right, Jason?
And I think that the challenge with that is the Ministry of Health would be operating in the context where they're promoting, as Ernie Smith says, for people to be having anal sex if you are promoting gay sex. So it's a little tricky there.
If you're doing health promotion about gay sex, the popular belief in Jamaica is that that would be illegal, and you would be, in some ways, facilitating or supporting gay sex. So the very act of informing people about the dangers is itself seen as a criminal act.
Yeah, no, it's not that it's a popular belief, it's the practical belief. And there's a distinction I'm making. I think when the health ministry says, what we're dealing with is people struggling with two things. The need for aggressive advocacy for rights and so on, and the pressing need to meet the pressures that people who are living with the disease, who may be gay, are going under. And so they're faced with an interesting dilemma, which is worth paying attention to. The dilemma is, if we can use the aggressive approach, which I believe is necessary, but if there'll be a cost for that, and that's the anxiety. And so if you say, if we do not put pamphlets out or we do not put a sign there, it is true that that is because of the pressure of a society that is violently homophobic on one hand, but at the same time, those who want to work that way have decided that for practical purposes, it is necessary to keep their anonymity to make things flow. So your point is quite right that if you're in a society that has reached that stage, it's a bad sign. But it doesn't mean that those taking the action to try and practically reach these people share that view, that that's what should be the case. And that's the distinction I'm trying to make.
I'm just going to ask Jason if you wanted to finish up, or okay. So as you can see, this is an incredibly complex issue, the way we approach both the fight against homophobia and how to address AIDS in this context. And with that, I want to move on to Nancy and talk a little bit about funding. And it seems to me, in my experience, there's a divide between the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender funders and the HIV funders, right? And it seems to me that one thing MAC/AIDS has done is really to expand the notion of what prevention can be and fund things like immigration equality, fund organizations like JFLAG, really making the statement that fighting homophobia is prevention. And I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about how you came to funding with that approach and where you see the gaps in the Caribbean when it comes to the donor community.
Sure, I was mentioning to Stephen Lewis, who's in the back, who's many of us are great fans of and works with you, that Michelle Sidibe last week, who's the head of UNAIDS, was saying that he fights for universal access for drugs for people who live with HIV, not because he believes it's possible, but because the fight for universal access underscores all of the social injustices that exist. And in the Caribbean, one of those, clearly there's many issues. There's violence against women and the position of women, there's homophobia, and there's also poverty, honestly. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our work in the Caribbean with the hope that we can have more company there and we can have more funders. It's been our enormous privilege to work with the people at this table. And I just met Kwame today, and I wish I had grown up to be a poet because I'm so very struck by your insight and thankful for that. But essentially, the Caribbean, as Julie mentioned and John mentioned, has the second highest rate of HIV in the world behind sub-Saharan Africa. But for some reason, there is a paucity, particularly of private funders in the region. We are a corporate foundation. We raise about $22 million a year. We are a different type of company. We're a makeup company. In fact, I showed Mika's video at a sales meeting last week, and people were horrified, and particularly because when they looked at the party video, they said that could be a MAC party. We are, as my boss lovingly says, a brand of misfits, which I'm happy to be part of. But we are a company that has a lot of gender bending, and what's interesting is that we are a $1 billion cosmetic company. And yes, and the United States is to a great extent also very uncomfortable with sexuality. I actually spent a lot of my career in prisons and jails where we do not give out condoms because having sex in prisons and jails is against the rules, and we believe if we give out condoms, they will have sex. So the Jamaican institutional belief pervades here as well, and some institutions more conservative. But essentially, we went into the Caribbean because we wanted to make a difference with, honestly, $3 or $4 million a year. We felt that we were close enough to the Caribbean geographically. We don't have regional offices, and we also have some businesses there. One thing that is striking to me about the Caribbean compared to, say, Africa, is there are very few employers in the Caribbean, aside from the tourism industry. And what you see in Africa is many, many companies are reliant upon production in Africa. And so they have many workforce intervention programs, testing and prevention, because the bottom line is HIV, in addition to being a horrible disease, is a very expensive disease and very hard on companies. What you do have in the Caribbean, of course, is tourism, and understandably, the Jamaican government, which wants to entice people to come visit, does not want to talk about the murders in Montego Bay of gay men. And so there is a sort of a fine line. We actually are sort of part of the tourism business because our business there is in airports. And so it gives us a little bit of an in, although we also sort of walk a fine line, I think, in terms of the work that we're doing. But one of the things I want to say is that as grave as these problems are, for literally $6.5 million over 3 years, I think we've been able to make an enormous difference. I remember when I was younger and I was working in prisons, I was trying to raise money for this AIDS hotline that I was running. And I was asking somebody about raising money, and a very experienced man who ran the Vera Institute said to me, "Money isn't the problem." Money isn't the problem, I can't pay the bills, money is the problem. He said the real problem is good ideas. And I think what you see here is this enormous reservoir of talent, really in what is a portfolio of sort of social and legal change 101. I mean, we have individual advocacy with JFLAG and immigration equality for people who want to stay in Jamaica, for people who want to leave Jamaica. We also fund Planned Parenthood for their work in women's clinics. Basically, poor women seek health care in reproductive health clinics, and we're funding those, you know, Planned Parenthood do some very good work, and Ida from Planned Parenthood is here. We're funding Stephen Lewis and Julia to do some systemic advocacy, and honestly, you know, to kick up a lot of noise. And the other piece, which is important to this portfolio, and which which has been beautifully done by John. You know, I mean, we never thought we'd win an Emmy, or you'd win an Emmy, and we're glad for that. But another piece of their work, for instance, was to get a piece about prisons on the front page of the Miami Post. So one of the things that's very striking to me about AIDS in the Caribbean is the lack of media attention. We tried to do our own media there, and there's basically one AP stringer that lives in the Dominican Republic. The Wall Street Journal, for instance, the person who covers the Caribbean lives in Mexico City. You know, countries that are widely divergent, and it's an area of the world that really has not been focused upon. And the other piece actually is we're funding the Global Fund. We funded it on American Idol. And we had this back and forth. We gave $1 million, but the Global Fund had to give it to the Caribbean. And American Idol informed us that Brian Seacrest, but we would only give them the money if they said for AIDS, HIV and AIDS in the Caribbean. And we got a call back, this is part of our bizarre grant-making job, from American Idol, and they said, it's too much of a mouthful. Brian Seacrest cannot say AIDS, HIV in the Caribbean. And you know, I'm lucky enough to have a very supportive boss, and I said, well, then you're not getting the $1 million. And they called us back an hour later, and Brian Seacrest managed to say AIDS, HIV in the Caribbean. One of the things that we tried to do is sort of, you know, as they say in fashion, mix high and low. We're mixing sort of H&M and Prada, in that we're mixing very small grassroots grants with Global Fund, because it's really important that JFLAG have a voice at Global Fund, and that we're sitting at the table and letting Global Fund know that more work needs to be done. If you look at the numbers for World Bank and PEPFAR and Global Fund, they look massive, over $1 billion. Somehow they keep smushing the Caribbean into Latin America, which obviously is and the Caribbean, you know, as all of you know, in very different countries. But the bottom line is there's almost no money for these small NGOs. And so however you approach your portfolio, if you were an NGO, there's plenty of good work to do. If you're looking at gay and lesbian rights, if you're looking at funding alternative media, if you're looking at funding healthcare, women's rights, there's so much good work to do. The Caribbean really is in this country's backyard. and there's so many in our company alone. We have so many Trinidadians and Jamaicans, and it is an area of the world where you can make an enormous difference. I know this is a time of funding. For instance, we're down 30%. That in some ways we're all reckoning to the extent to which we're doing more with less or less with less. And I think to some extent, honestly, we're doing less with less. You can do an enormous amount with a very small bit of money. The only other thing is, I sat on many panels where people continually leave the room. This is one of the few panels where people keep coming in the room and staying. So I think that's a good sign.
Thanks, Nancy. And case in point, J-Flag. Anyone who follows this issue, the issue of homophobia in Jamaica, there's never an article that does not mention J-Flag, and you would think that they are this huge national level organization. J-Flag is Jason and a half-time administrative assistant, or full-time or half-time? Full-time. Two people. Right. So, there is the benefit.
Yeah, you're not paying for leather couches or anything.
Actually, in the Office of Jamaica AIDS Support, you saw Stacey and Jarrett in the video that you saw. So, I mean, the AIDS organizations, the cutting-edge organizations that are really linking HIV and human rights are concentrated and working together, and there's so much bang for your buck in supporting the work that they're doing. So, to make that clear, and I think actually I want to jump from Nancy's point about media to ask both Kwame and Micah, whoever wants to address this. How are we going to deal with this? How, in a climate where there's diminishing global coverage and fewer and fewer correspondents based in outside of their headquarters and basically everyone sitting at their computers opining. How are we going to get this issue on the agenda?
That's a slow ball. I'll hit it. It's clear in the American media landscape that there's less and less international reporting going on. There are fewer and fewer venues every month now, literally, for reporting, particularly for this kind of reporting, particularly for depressing reporting, right? AIDS is an old story, it's a sad story. Nobody wants another program about AIDS unless you do it in a new way and in an innovative way. And I just have to throw the hat over to the Pulitzer Center for doing it in a new and innovative way, for building multilateral partnerships between MacAIDS, between The Atlantic Magazine, with Global Exchange, with, there's this project already exists, I think, on 5 different platforms. It's being broadcast on PBS, it's available on the website. School kids are going to be engaging with it. I think this is the way that you do it, frankly, if I can be so bold as to say. There aren't a lot of venues anymore. And so you're seeing the introduction of not-for-profit journalistic organizations that are now taking donor money to report on issues, but insulating the journalists so that we can actually go out and report. When I was asked to do this, they didn't tell me what to do. They just said HIV/AIDS in Jamaica, the Caribbean, second highest region in the world. I didn't know that, and I've done a lot of work on HIV/AIDS. And then with that, one starts to unravel a thread, HIV rates in the gay community. By creating that opportunity, we were able to go in depth and do some serious reporting and bring you back stories that otherwise you would just never see. I mean, these are not, we're on PBS, World Focus, they don't have the money to do this. They don't do pieces like this. Most people don't do pieces like this. And it's not because they don't want to, but because there's no money to pay for it. It took 4 months. That's the reality of this kind of work. If you want to go deep, if you want to actually try to understand something, it's easy to pop in and out and get a couple sound bites. But if you really want to have the time to understand a situation and unravel it, and then break it down and explain it back to people, it just takes time. And so I think there's a huge role for foundations. I think you are the future of international reporting in America to some degree.